In the ancient chronicles of 2 Kings, a story unfolds that pits the might of a king against the divine intervention of the heavens. The king of Syria, consumed by his ambition to conquer Israel, finds himself continually thwarted, his strategic plans unraveling at every turn. As frustration takes hold, paranoia seeps into his court. A traitor is suspected among his closest ranks. Yet the true source of his undoing lies not within his palace walls, but with a man who communes with the divine. His adversaries whisper of a prophet, Elisha, a servant of the Most High God, whose extraordinary position reveal even the most secret of counsels, spoken only in the intimacy of the bedchamber. Driven to desperation, the Syrian monarch commands a formidable army to seize this prophet, to silence once and for all the voice that thwarts him from the shadows. As dawn breaks over the city, Elisha and his servant face an encircling siege of soldiers, the air tense with impending conflict. But Elijah stands firm, his faith unshaken. "Fear not," he counsels his trembling servant, "for the battle is not as it seems. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." After a prayer, the servant's eyes are opened to a stunning reality. The hillside aflame with divine chariots and fiery horses, an unseen army ready for battle. At the very precipice of peril, as the army closes in with menacing intent, a moment of divine intervention unfolds. With the Syrian forces on the verge of seizing the prophet Elisha and his servant, a fervent plea ascends to the heavens. In response, the Almighty acts, striking the advancing army with sudden blindness. What once lurked as spiritual blindness has now manifested into tangible obscurity. Rendered helpless, the once formidable force now stands powerless, engulfed in darkness, entirely at the mercy of the prophet they sought to capture. In this astonishing turn of events, God shields his servant, delivering him from the clutches of his foes, showcasing a miraculous display of protective grace. This ancient narrative reveals a world beyond our sight. In the ethereal folds of reality, beyond the reach of mortal eyes, lies an imperceptible battlefield. This realm, invisible to us, is teeming with celestial warriors, angels and devils, and creatures of such fantastical nature they defy imagination. Here, an unending war rages, a silent clash of titanic forces, invisible yet palpable to those who sense the deeper currents of existence. This hidden battlefield is ruled by the powers that lurk in the spiritual firmament, unseen rulers and principalities that weave the dark tapestry of wickedness across the heavens. It is here that our true fight lies, in a realm that our eyes cannot discern, yet our spirits engage with every day. What then does it mean to wage war in a battle so profoundly hidden? How does one arm oneself for a fight against foes so intangible? Many in our midst turn to tools of earthly making, self-help doctrines, the soothing balm of positive thinking, seeking to armor themselves as David once did in Saul's ill-fitting metal. Yet, like David standing before Goliath with sling and stone, we must reject this untested armor, echoing his bold declaration, "I cannot fight with these, for they have not been proven." As a boy tending to his father's sheep in the wilderness, David faced threats more formidable than the common thief or stray wolf. It was there, amidst the rugged terrain, that he encountered the ferocity of bears and lions. Armed with nothing more than a simple sling and a handful of stones, and fortified by the invincible might of Yahweh, David confronted these fierce beasts with divine strength coursing through his veins. He struck them down one after another, their formidable forms no match for a boy anointed by God. David's unshakable confidence as he stood before the towering Philistine warrior Goliath was not rooted in any human skill or the protective assurance of armor. His trust lay solely in the mighty power of God himself. To King Saul, he declared with resolute boldness, "I killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will fall as they did." His voice carried the weight of divine certainty, a testament to his faith and past victories. Facing the giant, David's words thundered across the battlefield, a clarion call of defiance that echoed off the surrounding hills. "I come in the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel, whom you have defied. Salvation is not found in sword or spear, for the battle belongs to the Lord, and he will deliver you into my hands." With these words, David stepped into legend, a young shepherd boy turned warrior, his faith as potent as any weapon wielded by man. Like David, we too are called to arm ourselves with divine weapons, forged in the spiritual fires of the Almighty, potent and proven in the annals of heavenly warfare. These are the weapons designed to tear down strongholds, to shatter the chains of darkness. Our charge is to fight, not as mere warriors, but as bearers of divine will, knowing with unwavering faith that the ultimate victory is not ours to claim, but the Lord's to bestow. We engage in this battle heartened by the certainty of triumph, for the outcome is preordained, sealed by the promise of an eternal kingdom. Thus, armed with heavenly might and guided by the unseen hand of the divine, we step into the fray, soldiers not of earth, but of the light, champions in a spectral war that rages silently all around us. Welcome to the Men of the King podcast. Today's episode, we look at the biblical doctrine of spiritual warfare. All right, well, welcome to the podcast. I'm here with my good buddy Jason Glover, who is also an elder with me at Emmanuel Baptist here in Salisal. And so we're going to be talking with him today about a few things. But first off, I wanted to kind of just give him the opportunity to kind of tell everybody who he is, kind of your background, your testimony. And I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you talk.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up kind of all over the place. I always say I grew up in Clarksville, Arkansas, which is just right down I-40 here.
Okay.
Dad was in the Navy early on, so he kind of bounced around. He went into manufacturing after that, which is a very similar lifestyle. You kind of bounce from place to place. But I spent about 8 years in Clarksville, and they were kind of the formative years of life. Mm-hmm. Both of my parents are from Tahlequah, so if you kind of just draw that 2-hour circle there, I spent a ton of time just in there. And was really kind of fortunate. I'm probably one of the last, people born in that Gen X generation. Right. And so, we learned how to type on typewriters, mm-hmm. and the internet was something that existed like in a building, right? On the college campus that I went to. It wasn't necessarily in everybody's house. And so I kind of had that childhood, that mm-hmm. Coming of age in the early 90s, growing up in the 80s, mm-hmm. and, the Star Wars stuff, mm-hmm. Is nostalgic for me. Yep. Right. And so just really kind of what you would think of small town, mostly rural, lower middle class kind of upbringing. Both parents had to work, and so mm-hmm. I would kind of come home, and me and my sister would do who knows what, right? Ride bikes, drink out of hoses, good times. Yeah. But at some point, you start thinking about, okay, so what am I going to do? My dad was in the military. I had a grandpa in the military, and so that just kind of, it's one of those things that runs in the family. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I've always said that the military is kind of a family business anyway. And so I did that. I enlisted in the Army after high school. and did that for off and on. I had a couple breaks in service, but I did that, most of my adult life, almost 17 years. And at one point decided like at the end of my enlistment, so about 8 years in, I decided to go to seminary. I grew up in a Christian household, and so there wasn't. I don't really remember a time that church or Christianity kind of wasn't around in some flavor. I don't know. I think I had what you might call a conversion experience at a camp, where I think I kind of realized, this applies to me. I'm definitely a sinner that needs some level of rescue.
Right.
And probably 10, 11, 9, 10, 11, somewhere in there.
Yeah. Okay.
And so from that kind of 10-year-old understanding, had that kind of a conversion experience. And throughout my life, that's always kind of that almost cultural Christianity even has always kind of been in the background. And so I'm not saying that wasn't a real conversion experience. I think it was. It's just, at 10 years old,
right.
How much spiritual warfare or anything like that have you really experienced?
Right.
And so, I say that my Christian experience or my, Christian walk looks a lot like the stock market charts that you would see. Sometimes there's huge crashes and everything blows up, and we wonder how it's going to keep going. and then sometimes you're kind of riding on the good times. But so I decided to go to seminary after my first tour in Iraq. So mid-20s. Not really to be a vocational pastor or anything, just to better understand what this was that I claimed to believe in most of my life. So I went to Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis. Graduated. I have a master's in theology and then another one in counseling, and was still kind of vocationally unsure when I graduated seminary. And so, given the fact that I had spent almost a decade in the Army and then I had these degrees now, I figured I'd just go back into the military and do the chaplain corps thing.
Yeah.
So I did that for a while, and eventually got out kind of for good a few years ago. The knees, shoulders, all that just kind of wore out.
Right.
And eventually there's an expiration date.
As they tend to do.
On every soldier. And so that time came, and I got out. But kind of in the middle of that, I went and got an MBA part-time. Went, on Saturdays. The University of Arkansas had a program. So I'm an accountant by trade, but I have this weird sort of eclectic educational background.
Yeah.
My bachelor's, my bachelor's was in psych technically, but I took all of the accounting classes.
Right.
And so I, could have a double major in accounting, and then the seminary stuff and the MBA in corporate finance. So I'm an accountant now, but that's kind of like the quick Cliff Notes run through of my background.
Cool.
Very mundane, but the thing is, and I don't say that in a I'm down on it kind of way.
Right.
I feel fortunate to have grown up in a Christian community. The bluegrass Southern gospel stuff of this part of the world, and just all the things that come with that. And I don't have like a dramatic conversion story or anything like that. But part of me is kind of glad that I don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
In some ways.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think mine would be similar, and I think that a couple things I'll say about that is just the idea that because that's exactly how mine was. I mean, I remember how old I was. I was 7, and you kind of look at that, and it's kind of like what you said, about how much theology or how much spiritual warfare has a 7-year-old really done. But I also look at that, who just what 7-year-old out of the blue just
that's right,
goes to their mom and says, "Hey, I need to talk," you know, and it's about this coming to faith in Christ. And so to me, even though that for a lot of years was kind of like, man, I don't have this big dramatic testimony where I was, deep dark into this deep darkness, and I came into this light. I've always just kind of been, and that's the testimony my kids are going to have.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, that's the testimony my kids are going to have, that they've just really have always just kind of believed, and that's okay. I mean,
in fact, I think that's the model that we see.
Yeah.
Some denominations will call it like a more covenantal model, but I mean, essentially, the job of the parent is kind of to disciple, right? So that's kind of the natural flow of it,
right?
The expectation. And I think we've romanticized a lot of things, and I think that can be one of them. We feel lesser to some extent if we come out of a background that's maybe more, just what we would call mundane. But really, I think if the system, in air quotes, is working like it should be working, I mean, that should be more of our stories,
right? John Piper, he talks about, because he had a similar upbringing, and he was preaching in his Romans series where he preaches through Romans. That's one thing he makes note of. He says, "This is where I found my This was where I found my testimony." And I saw, even though, like I said, I've always kind of grew up in church and believed, I found how I discovered in Romans how wicked I was, and how much I really needed, a Savior. And so he said, through the reading of Romans, I kind of discovered, my testimony.
Yeah. Well, and you discover that there's even a war going on.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big things that kind of shook me, leaving the country for the first time, seeing that not everything is like this, and when you've got do we need to get that?
No.
When not the so for instance, you see it's a break in the matrix, and you see that wow, there's evil in a different way and capacity here, but then you come back home and having been absent from this particular culture for a while, the gaps in our own world kind of become even more clear, that we were just kind of it's the frog in the boiling pot. We just get so used to it.
Yeah.
The way I've kind of formulated it in my mind is that we'll take a step back. So the reason that the military spends so much money training people for combat is because of, to some degree, how unnatural it really is. There's a really interesting book written probably 15 or 20 years ago called, I think it's On Killing or On War or something like that. It was written by an Army Ranger after he retired. And he talks about how if you look at the number of rounds per casualty in early conflicts, I mean, it was astronomical. Guys would intentionally shoot way off just because they didn't want to have to, actually shoot at somebody. And so the military kind of looked at this as a problem, right, because of the expense associated with it and just how, uneconomical and efficient that whole process was, right? And so they spent tons of money. They, in some ways, studied the propaganda of it. And so, your targets move from being circles with bullseyes to being silhouettes of people, just to get you associated with shooting at something that is of a human form, right? They changed up the cadences. I could get in. Some of it would be wildly inappropriate for this application, but they train you in that way because it doesn't come naturally.
Right.
You know?
Sure.
And so if spiritual warfare were something we would naturally want to fight against, I don't know that the Bible would talk so much about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like from what I've seen, the natural man wants to retreat or surrender at any given moment of hardship or conflict
Mm-hmm.
with spiritual things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really no different in the real world. You have to be trained into fighting,
Mm-hmm.
you know, sort of
Right.
convince your psyche that it's something that you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a cause big enough to make that worth it,
Mm-hmm.
right? To overcome some of those unnatural, you
Mm-hmm.
know, blocks in your mind. And really, as we talk about like conversion, it's really no different. Like, I think the natural part of us in an unregenerate state, and even in a regenerate state where you're still battling the flesh, would rather retreat or just surrender.
Yeah.
As opposed to fighting it, you know. And so it's interesting, and you may be able to relate in the kind of the era that we grew up in. You know, I think surrendering to the spirit of the age looks fairly obvious, right?
Right.
But the retreat, I grew up where there was a very, very strong and lucrative Christian subculture.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were honest with myself, I think that most of my like teen and early adult years were a retreat into that bubble, right? Because I don't want to surrender to the world. I want to be a
Right.
Christian,
Right.
but I definitely don't want to have to
Mm-hmm.
go out here and risk the disapproval of the world,
Right.
And so we kind of pull back into this enclave where we kind of have this little artificial bubble for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I spent a ton of time there.
Yeah.
To the point where I've looked back with some conviction on that, you know. And we can talk more about how, like, I don't think having, for instance, like, you know, Christian music, I don't think that's wrong.
Right.
Obviously.
Right.
But I think it can be used. I think that subculture can be used for avoidance. I don't think it necessarily has to.
Right.
But I think it can be. And I don't know. You may have seen some of that because we're roughly the same age.
Yeah, absolutely. You had the big, the purity movement. It was, I think it was Josh Harris that I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and that was kind of, that was kind of more into my teen years and young adults period. But yeah, I can see that where essentially, it was like Christendom had these kind of things that really mimicked what other, you know, kind of mimicked the world in a sense, but it was something that we could kind of have that was not the old hymns that you sung in church. So it was kind of maybe a way for our generation to kind of make our faith maybe a little bit our own. But I do see that.
And that's, you know, I think in every era really of humanity, there is some level of, you know, the Essenes running off into the desert, into caves, and you know, we've seen this with monasteries. We've seen it with the Amish from an American, a more American slant.
Yeah.
You know. And again, I'm not gonna bash that culture. There's a ton of good stuff there. It's just I think that's how I used it.
Yeah,
you know?
Sure.
I think that was kind of my introduction to the spiritual warfare that it existed in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. For me, it was a retreat.
Yeah.
Of sorts, you know. What's interesting too, I think I got this from R.C. Sproul. He did a lecture series about spiritual warfare a long time ago. I think this is who that came from, but he talked about not being conformed to the world, but being transformed by the renewal of your mind. That Paul passage, and And actually, I think he tied it to Jesus's high priestly prayer, because I think in that prayer, if I'm not mistaken, again, this is probably something that I should have looked up, but Jesus doesn't pray that we would be taken out of the world, but that we would not be given into evil.
Yeah.
And so, kind of dovetailing off of that, R.C. Sproul says that to not be conformed, but to be transformed, like the meaning lies in those prefixes. And so, to conform, the prefix con means with, to not be with that system, with the spirit of the age, but be transformed. Of course, trans being, like transcendent, to be above it and, to excel above it, really. It would be the goal.
Right.
And so when you look at it, the way to fight that then becomes how do we do this better?
Yeah.
In all aspects of life. A lot of my generation kind of thought that unless you were going to seminary to be a preacher, that you were going to be a subclass of Christian.
Right. Yeah.
And in reality, when you kind of look at the way that unfolds in Scripture and the encounters that Jesus has, there really is a sense in which, okay, so you're going to be a soldier, just go be a really good one. Don't complain about what you get paid. Be fair and honest.
Yep.
And make that a transcendent occupation for you. Christians should be making movies.
Yeah.
We should be making music. We should be doing it better.
Yeah.
We should be in politics. We should be doing it better.
Yeah.
I think, though, that when we think about spiritual warfare, there's the hesitancy is always there. But also, we have this picture in our mind of what it means to fight something, right? And that usually comes with anger and aggression.
Yeah.
And a lot of finger pointing. And not that there's not a time and a place for maybe some of that. But I don't think we often think of fighting a war by being better in every capacity.
Yeah. Well, I think I think we have been maybe taught, or maybe there's this kind of I don't know, there's this kind of weird kind of thing around the term spiritual warfare, and it kind of gets kind of into a convoluted mess, and you start hearing people marching around place. I mean, and so I read a book. I read a book by a guy named Jim Osman. I think it's his name. And his and it was over spiritual warfare, and basically the premises he asked is it truth or territory, and ultimately I think we tend to, especially in this area. I mean, I know, and you've probably encountered this, to where you'll hear people say, well, this area of the county is really cursed, and there's like this darkness over it, but the reality is spiritual warfare is more about, you talking about, spiritual warfare is more about truth than anything. Yeah. I mean, it is, we talking about conversion. I mean, it's right there in that, the front lines of spiritual warfare is really a battle for truth. And I think in the 80s, and like you said, in every generation, I think people want to fight in that battle, but it's almost like kind of like what you was talking about in the military. We haven't been really taught how to do it. We haven't really. We've been kind of. You have people over here saying, "Get behind me, Satan," or trying to rebuke devils and stuff like that. And the reality is, man, I just don't know if there's any mandate for that in scriptures. Really, the mandate is for shedding light on the truth, and that's where the battle really lies.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is that this Platonic, like this philosophical Platonic dualism that kind of has seeped into our culture, right? And so we've got this thought that if you put the word spiritual in front of anything, that it necessarily becomes something that is other dimensional and spooky and necessarily separate from what I'm going to wake up and do on a Tuesday or a Thursday. And in reality, I don't think that was ever a helpful distinction. You know, we're a spirit and a body, right? So we'll be resurrected as a spirit and a body. Spiritual warfare, you know, while we're not at war with, you know, we're at war with the principalities and all the stuff that Scripture talks about, that takes place like very much on a Thursday morning, you know, on your drive to work. Like there's something very mundane about how this war has crept into most of our lives. And I think it's an innocent mistake, but again, we want to romanticize the solution through casting out of demons and just, we don't think of it in terms of you know, salting every conversation with truth. You know, what's funny is I say this, and immediately what comes to mind is a missed opportunity I had yesterday with a guy that I know really well that wouldn't be offended if I said, actually, I kind of disagree with that, right? And here's why. But in the moment, it goes back to it's way easier to retreat or to just kind of surrender a point because, man, I just don't want to mess with it.
Yeah.
But see, I think that's the war.
Yeah, it is.
And there was nothing, there was nothing fantastical about it. It was just, it's a mundane conversation that you kind of season with truth, like you were saying.
Right.
And then let that seed grow, which is something I'm awful at, right?
Yeah.
Because I think ultimately what we want is to be able to have some city center moment where you stand on a box and preach something and the streets are flooded with revival. And in reality, it's just, I mean, that can happen. It's just, it's not necessarily how it always goes.
Yeah, right.
But it really seems to me that if we were taught it's almost like this incremental, constant sprinkling in of truth into every moment that we possibly can.
Yeah.
I think we would think differently about it. You know.
Yeah.
It's not. So I'm a real bad all or nothing personality. And so to me, unless I've got an hour and a half with you and we can sit down and actually do the proper debate, like I almost think, what's the point?
Yeah, right.
But when do we ever get an hour and a half with an unbelieving friend at a wrestling practice?
Right.
You know, where we're kind of half distracted.
Right.
You know, I mean, I just think it's little incremental things that we miss out on because of that temptation.
It's so it's so interesting in the modern age we live in, because it's like, it has made us way more efficient, I guess you could say that, but at the same time it's kind of made time speed up a little bit, you know, and it's like so it's almost like sometimes it's almost like we're afraid sometimes, man, this is going to turn into something.
Yeah.
if I go down this rabbit hole, it's going to turn into this big long conversation, and I got to get home for dinner, and you know, I mean, and so and that's really it. I mean, it's all of us.
Yeah.
I mean, like it.
And for me, as much as I hate to admit it, there's still that tinge of the fear of man that's sprinkled in there.
Yeah.
You know, what will these people think if they find out that I disagree with them about fill in the blank?
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And I don't know that we were ever taught how to debate well in schools. Not that school is the source of all of our problems, but, you know, how many of us really grew up in houses or schools or in circles where there was even around the dinner table, oh, that's interesting. Well, what do you think about this? Where there was like pushback and let's talk about that. You know, so you think this, I think this. Give me your top 5 reasons.
Yeah.
Let's. I don't know that I've ever encountered that. And it's hard because we grow up fairly self-centered, especially I think in our culture. And when you disagree with me, it's like, what do you mean you disagree with me?
Right.
How dare you? How dare you disagree with me?
Right.
I never knew what to do. You know.
Well, you end up, and I mean I've had this conversation before. You end up, if you don't have those conversations, if you don't like you said, I mean, if you don't sit down and talk things out and ask questions, and what you end up with is you'll take that person's perspective and you'll kind of turn it into a caricature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not it's just like with when people look at, say, the charismatic, the televangelists that are on TV, and that's their picture of Christianity, which is really just a caricature of what true Christianity is, and so that's what they have in their mind. Anytime you say, well, I'm a Christian, it's like, oh, you're that, and it's like, no, I'm not that. I'm something different, because that's not really a good representation of what.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens a lot of times and I think that's happened throughout history. I listened to James White has this big long history, church history thing that I've listened to a couple of times, and he talks about how, I mean, you'll find out that the people that wrote this about these people were the ones that kind of won the struggle, and you're not always as fair with your opponents as you'd like to think you are.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, and there's a lot of truth to that. Well, and Christians aren't the only ones whose natural inclination it is to retreat or surrender. Right. And so we can caricature our enemies, but you know what I'm saying, and we can caricature those that disagree with us, but we're also going to have the same thing happen to us, because really it's just as easy for them to kind of stay in their little academic enclaves as well. And there's something nice about those echo chambers where we always kind of get our back scratched in the exact right spot, and aren't really forced to see what it is they really believe. There's me and you have talked before about different Joe Rogan podcasts and guests he's had on, and it's always pretty plain when you're hearing somebody talk about Christianity that hasn't really ever spent a ton of time dealing with the theology of Christianity, because it's they get in talking and you're like, yeah, that's not what I believe at all.
Right.
It's almost the definition of a straw man at that point. And it's unfortunate, because it's like you've got a ton of really smart people that could probably really advance a good debate and conversation, but it's we even do that with our own denominations, though. Until I really started studying what it was Roman Catholics thought, I had done the same thing to them. So
right.
But kind of back to where we started with the spiritual warfare thing. That's part of it. That's part of the spiritual war. That it's easy to become comfortable.
Yeah. Right.
And not search out what are the arguments against what I'm saying.
Right. Right. But yeah, I think we get to a place to where it's like, what if I get talked out of this? And this is, again, you go back to, man, I grew up with this. I mean, my mom and my dad, I mean, they raised me in this, and so I know there have been times in my life that where something that I was so. And I hate to use the word religion, but that's the reality of it. It's when you're kind of raised in this religion, and there are things that are kind of part of the orthodoxy of your heart. It's like, and so, but then you get old and you start kind of like maybe searching the scripture for yourself, and it's like, well, that doesn't track. I mean, why did we believe this, or why did we go? I mean, that way on this particular subject, and you start kind of like, I don't believe that anymore. I think that this is probably the proper understanding of Scripture, and there is when that happens, there's a wrestling that you have to do. I mean, there's a warfare that you. I mean, that's where it is. I mean, that's where the warfare kind of exists with the truth, because the scripture I was going to read was, I'll go ahead and pull it up. It's 1 Corinthians. I think it's 1 Corinthians 10. Might be 2 Corinthians 10, but we'll pull it up real quick, and it's come on. I think it might be. I think it might be 2 Corinthians, where it talks about the weapons of our warfare. And I could probably get pretty close to quoting it, but basically he says the weapons of our warfare are, right here. He says, so 2 Corinthians 10, it says, for though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging a war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. And so when I was reading this book, Truth or Territory, that's, Osmond's argument was, listen, I mean, what we're destroying is these arguments, these things that doctrines, teachings, ideas, thoughts, anything that raises itself against the knowledge of God, which is the scripture. That's what we use these tools for. And so when you encounter something that you've believed your entire life, and it's kind of tied to your faith, but then you realize, wow, that's not maybe that was a misunderstanding, or I don't know where they got that from scripture, and you stop believing it. And maybe it's tied to a practice, maybe it's not, but you stop doing that. You kind of cast that out of your religious thought, and there's something to that, and it's you almost feel like you're betraying something, and
it's a shift in paradigm. And so my analogy is, I grew up like some of my best like snapshot memories are, do you remember those big boxy Chevy trucks from the 80s? Creedence Clearwater Revival in one of those. I can smell it. I can feel the air.
Right.
So it's like that's kind of the soundtrack to the good times, right? And essentially that's what a paradigm is. It's the backdrop on which everything hangs. And when that changes, if it were to come out that John Fogerty can't really sing, that was just created, via computer, like
digital.
Like now what? like half of my Americana backdrop is destroyed. But it's why, even what you just read, it's why so much of Scripture reorients you towards, you have to change the way you think about this stuff. You're transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Yeah, right.
Because I had a professor, I don't remember where, but they were a big cognitive behavioral proponent, model of like talk therapy, for instance. But this one professor's thesis was essentially everything begins with your thoughts and flows. So a situation occurs. The situation in and of itself as a standalone thing has almost little to no meaning to it, right? This is him talking. It gets filtered through your cognitive processes and becomes emotions and behaviors. And so the story I always tell was that early in, and she's heard me tell this story a million times, so she's on board. Early in our marriage, I think we were still on active duty. We had been fighting over something just real inconsequential. Like, actually, I even remember the fight, and so I'll even embarrass myself by telling you what it was about. So, in on-post housing, you sign for a house on base in the same way that I would check a gun out of the armory.
Okay.
Like, I've got to give that back.
Right.
Right? And when I give it back, it has to be an identical condition
Mm-hmm.
to what I received, or they'll charge you for it. Like, there's somebody that comes through and inspects your house when you leave.
Oh, wow.
And just says, hey, that chip wasn't there, those blinds weren't broken. You know, you can't get out of here until you fix all that stuff. So she wanted to hang curtains. And I was like, I'm not drilling a hole in that wall because I'm going to have to fill that.
Right.
You're not going to have to fill that.
Right.
I'm never here. We're
Right.
always in the field. I'm always off training. I'm always deployed.
Right.
Like, I don't want to get back. It's time to leave. And now I've got to take leave for a week to come back and patch all these
Right.
holes. I don't want to do it. So in her mind, she's not going to allow me. I'm not going to allow her to build a home here. And in my mind, you're trying to make my life more difficult.
Yeah,
right.
right.
That's the fight. And so I go to work that day and just have top 10 most awful days that you can ever have. And she called me at lunch for something, and she said, hey, how's it going? I said, I don't know that I can do this anymore. And in her mind, like, she's thinking about this fight we have. She thinks I'm talking about us being married.
No.
I have already forgotten that.
Yeah,
because
right.
it's inconsequential.
Right.
You know, ultimately, I don't care what you do.
Right.
Like, I'll fill the holes if I have to.
Right.
It was all for effect, right? It was hyperbole. Whatever. I was talking about work. But the rest of my day, it ended up being fine. Like, but she's at home, like, in existential breakdown because she thinks that we're going to get a divorce.
Yeah.
Because I just told her I don't think I can do this anymore. But it was we each had a different thought about what that comment meant. And my emotion was I got to vent a little bit. Maybe I felt a little bit better, or maybe my day was a little bit better.
But it just wrecked her.
It just wrecked her.
Yeah.
And so it's a dumb example, right? But it's why I think Scripture spends so much time on your paradigms, your mental thought processes, taking every thought captive, being transformed by the renewing of your mind, destroying arguments.
Yeah.
I mean, arguments come from the paradigms that we've built.
Right.
And the good news is that can all be in the arena of ideas. You know, we don't have to lose friends over that.
Right.
But unfortunately, going back to what we were saying, I mean, how many of us have really been?
And I think that's why. I think that's one of the things where there's such a again, it goes back to what you said. We really haven't been. It would really benefit us if we had some training in spiritual warfare. And I don't know that we spend enough time on that because I think that while it is a battle for truth, while it is, this is very aggressive. I mean, it's very aggressive language here. It's talking about weapons, but he's saying we don't do this according to the flesh. Our weapons of our warfare, they destroy strongholds. They take captive, they punish. I mean, so this is a very aggressive language, but yet Paul also says, I think it's in one of the Timothys where he says the servant of the Lord shouldn't strive, but you got to be gentle. Yeah. So you got to speak the truth in love. You've got to. I think the last podcast we were talking about how we Christians a lot of times, and not just Christians. I mean, I say Christians because this is a Christian podcast, but everybody, we talk at people so much, and we don't ask questions. We don't sit there and let's just have a calm, even keel like discussion about our differences, and maybe we can arrive at hey, we'll just agree to disagree, and that's fine.
Yeah. Well, and at some point, we have turned the word love into something that's not going on offense. So, they talk about the gates of hell not prevailing against the church. A gate from a military perspective, is a defensive structure.
Right.
Like, I gate things that I want to keep you out of.
Right.
And so the fact that the gates of hell aren't going to prevail necessarily means we're playing offense.
Yes,
we're attacking their defensive structures. And so in love, we have changed love to something that means, again, retreat or surrender, because we're not comfortable with any level of conflict. And I don't know if that's generational. You know, I don't know if it's in our particular culture, especially like in the South and in the West, nice is the best thing that you can be. And you don't have to be real mean, but there is a level of offense that's expected in the very language of the passages that you read about this.
Yeah.
And actually the most loving thing you can do is go play offense. It's what you're called to. Even in the garden, before sin entered the world, Adam's call was to dominion. It's, you don't stay in the garden, you go out and play offense in the world in whatever capacity that looks like before sin. You know, cultivation, you know, who knows?
It's love, but it as we read, I mean, here this is aggressive language. It's an aggressive love.
It really is. Yeah. We get so used to playing defense that we think offense is unloving. You know, almost as if we're so afraid of offending somebody in their sin that becomes the cardinal sin, when in reality, maybe there's a time and a place for somebody to be a little bit offended. I know that some of the best things in the world that ever happened to me were times that somebody offended my sensibilities when I was wrong.
Well, if my child goes out into the field and starts trying to play with a copperhead, I'm going to be aggressively loving.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm going to be aggressively loving that child.
Yeah. Well, and even if you see them becoming manipulative or lying,
right,
or like, these are all things that my wife and I have had to kind of fumble through. Man, we got to put a stop to this.
Yes.
And there's a way to communicate severity when you're doing this that I think is good and appropriate. And to use a military example, I've been yelled at by platoon sergeants before, and you just kind of take it, right? You know, you're a young private, you're out there, you know, filling up sandbags at a rate that wasn't acceptable. Right. You get yelled at, right? As an officer, I've been yelled at by colonels before. That's a completely different.
Yeah.
Because they don't care about the rate at which you fill sandbags. They're concerned with bigger transgressions. And you can tell by the severity of the moment, wow, that's a bigger deal than the other one. And that's a valuable lesson to learn. Because, look, ultimately there are things that will save your life, you know, spiritually and physically, that are a pretty big deal.
Right.
And it's, you know, the unwillingness to confront sin or bad ideas or bad arguments, which I'm guilty of, has dire consequences, you know, and that's something that I'm fairly convicted about often.
Yeah.
Because it's just easier to not do anything.
Yeah.
It's easier to not play offense.
Yeah.
You know? So.
Well, you know, you mentioned that, and I think this is the thing that we have to understand, because we do. So it's aggressive love. It's we're aggressively loving. We're aggressively using these weapons in love, with gentleness. Because, I mean, if we go to Ephesians, and you know what Paul says here, we walk in the flesh, but we don't war after the flesh. But in Ephesians, what does he say? We don't. Our struggle isn't with flesh and blood. I mean, the people that we engage with, most of the, I would say probably 100% of the time, and I think we could even say sometimes we're even under this oppression, influence, whatever you want to call it. But he says that we don't war against the flesh and blood, but we war against principalities and powers. And there is an unseen realm where there is that heavily influences our culture, the people around us, kings, presidents. There is a culture around us. There's people around us that are heavily influenced by, not by demons. And so that's. But again, the battle is with the truth, because if you can, and I say you can, but it's really if Christ through us, through our obedience, by engaging in spiritual warfare, can convince a sinner that of the truth, and that because the reality is the folks that are around us, the people that we're engaged with on a day-to-day basis, your friend at wrestling practice, they're under the influence of unseen forces. They're deceived. And so when we look at a world that really around us is just deceived, then you can kind of have empathy for them. It's like, man, I would be in that same boat if the light of the gospel hadn't shined in my heart, and God wouldn't have convinced me. I would be in the same boat that they're in. And so having empathy to approach them, not talk at them, but just talk, listen, have conversation, and ask them questions that might lead them to, well, have you? Because a lot of times the insanity of our world, a wrong worldview is usually it just doesn't play out logically.
No, and when you take things to their logical conclusions, you're exactly right.
Yeah,
you're exactly right. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And Martin Luther's famous quote of we face the world, the flesh, and the devil. Mm-hmm. There's a lot playing against you, and that against any human being. So the fact that any of us have the light to see the error in our logical conclusions is the sovereignty of God in our lives,
absolutely.
Right? Because when you think about that trifecta of an enemy, the world being the system, the economy that runs what's going on is fallen.
Yeah.
Our own selves. I think it's James that says, like, look, you're deceived because your own desires drag you away and deceive you. Like, you're fighting yourself too. And then the devil, so now you're saying that it's the system I'm in is corrupt. I'm corrupt. And then I've got somebody who's actively trying to corrupt me. The fact that any of us come out of this thing is kind of incredible when you think about it.
Christianity really is the ultimate religion for conspiracy theorists, because it is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy of our own flesh, mm-hmm. the devil, and the world. You've got. I think the first or the second chapter of Ephesians, that's what he's saying, is you walked according to this world, according to your own desires, and under the control of the devil.
Yeah.
And so you have. If you're a natural man out there kind of trying to do this on your own, the deck is stacked against you.
Yeah. Well, and I think that all those systems want to try to convince you that you're the point and you're the hero of the story. Mm-hmm. And what I read in the Bible is that Christianity, when taken at a 30,000-foot view, is really a rescue religion.
Yeah.
And the hero of the story is Jesus. And really everything is about God and his glory. Mm-hmm. And so to make this about us really in any way is starting us off on a wrong paradigm.
Yeah.
And I think that helps too in playing offense, mm-hmm. because I'm not the hero. I'm not somebody that God doesn't have to have me. He chooses to use me, right, mm-hmm. for this. Really, it's all the glory belongs to him anyway. So, look, there's really no pressure.
Right.
Win, lose, or fail, he's going to do what he's going to do. Mm-hmm. I'm just called to go out and be a good soldier for this, right? At no point in time in any conflict was I ever really concerned with, the popularity polls of me in any of these countries. And in fact, you expect that it's not good, which wasn't always the case actually. But what do you expect? It's a war. But God's sovereign, and He chooses to use us, and to remember that really we've been rescued, and He's the hero of the story. Yeah. Kind of removes the pressure, and centers us back on what's the most important.
Yeah.
Because again, our tendency with our own flesh and desire is to make us the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a good segue, because I want to kind of shift, but I'll kind of help get us there.
Yeah.
So last night we were in youth. We were in small group, and our friend Wadey, who's also a fellow elder with us there at the church, he was talking about how his worldview of God, of course, growing up, he grew up kind of similar to us. I think he grew up in a maybe a little bit more of a fundamental hellfire and brimstone type guy, but he said he always viewed God as this mean kid that's just burning ants, and when talking about hell and that type of thing, and so I was talking to teens. I said, that's really it's really not a good people who have that view of God. First of all, they don't understand the seriousness, the weight, the true weight of their sin.
Mm-hmm.
And was talking about how I love this analogy, and I can't remember where I heard this, but the thought is if I walked up to you and if I just smacked you across the face, there would be consequences, more than likely. I mean, there would probably be retaliation. However, if I walked up to, say, Derek Griffey, who's an Oklahoma State trooper, and when he was in uniform, if I did that same thing, there'd be more severe consequences, because that would be assaulting an officer. If I did that to the President of the United States, then you're talking about way more severe, consequences. And so my point was, the higher the office, the more severe the consequences. Well, God is the highest office that there is, period. The highest office in existence, and our sin is ultimately against Him. And so that's what, and then kind of turned it to, like, when God punishes us, He punishes that punishment. Even though we don't like to talk about hell, that eternal punishment is the equal punishment for our sin. It's the just punishment for our sin because of who we have sinned against. Mm-hmm. And so, but in Christianity, that God doesn't want that. I mean, He says, "I take no pleasure in the death of the sinner." And ultimately, He is the hero. Yes, you've sinned against the highest office in the land, so to speak, and your punishment is this, and it's just. But I'm here to rescue you. I'm here if your sin will either be punished by punishing you for eternity, or it's punished in Christ.
Yeah.
And so you can put your faith in Christ, and Christ has absorbed that punishment for you, or you can wait and absorb that punishment yourself and you won't be able to bear it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk. So that kind of leads me to, and I know I didn't tell you about this, and so forgive me if you're not ready for this, but one time we were in, I think, a Sunday school discussion, and you can just kind of. But you were talking about the rich man and Lazarus, and there were some really cool things that you had to say about the rich man. About, and I know one of them, but I wanted to just kind of talk about the rich man and Lazarus, and kind of.
Well, and I'll preface it by saying, it's been a long time since I looked at that, but I always reserve the right to be wrong. These are just
your observations. Yeah, right.
So I think one of the big ones that I took away from that was Lazarus, the rich man. Number one, he's not named in the parable.
Right.
Lazarus is, right?
Right.
And so I think by that we're meant to understand that being rich was this man's identity.
Mm-hmm.
And as he's in hell, and to what degree this parable intends to be describing hell, I don't really know.
Right.
But while he's in hell, he still is the hero in his mind of his own story. He still wants to be able to command Lazarus around. It's almost like his own sin against God and ultimately also against himself, but ultimately against God, has so consumed him that he's unable to see the center of the story as anybody but himself.
Yeah.
So that even while he's in torment, it's not a, hey, now I believe. It's send somebody to make this better for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a. I'm sure he wanted out, right? But his knee-jerk reaction isn't, I repent, I believe,
right.
I want out. It's, I just want you to come here and make this easier to deal with. He wants the same economy that he had in this world that's perishing to carry through. And look, we're all guilty of this to some level, right? We feel like we've worked hard and we deserve all this and somehow all of this should carry on. God is the hero of the story.
Right.
Like, it's anything that's ultimate is from him, by him, for him.
Yeah.
We really do just serve at the pleasure of the King.
Yeah.
And ultimately the reward is that you're with him for eternity.
Right.
But under that condition that he's still the king, right? And that we're not in a place to be making demands,
right.
Of anybody. But I think in my mind, if I'm recalling that parable, what stood out to me was just that he is so consumed by the paradigm of this world. And when you talk about the world, the flesh, and the devil, we can so buy into the game of this world and the scoreboard that it has for us, that becomes who we are. And throughout the Bible, Paul especially talks about that we're not our own, we're bought with a price. That it's we belong to him. He becomes our identity. That's who we are. We're not the some product of what we've accomplished in this world. But to make that the point, it deteriorates you like a battery acid to where that's all you can become.
Yeah, right.
And then no matter, and I think even in the parable, who is it? Is it Moses or Abraham?
Abraham.
So Abraham is even saying, look, send it whoever you want. They're not going to, his brothers, they're not going to believe you.
Right.
Right? Meaning that, like, man, you're so far gone. Like, you're so ate up with this that it's, at this point, it's not even possible for you to see anything else, which is really, really, really scary. How the world and its structures can so deteriorate you that you become incapable of even seeing outside of what that paradigm builds.
Right.
Whether it's chasing wealth, which to some extent, don't we all?
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Some level of acclaim. I know, look, this is so petty, but I'll tell you, I think it's part of the spiritual warfare that I've been convicted of is youth activities. And so, not church youth activities, right? But like, so, are we more focused on Levi's drum lessons and making him excellent at that?
Yeah.
Now, look, nobody's going to argue harder for excellence than me.
Right.
In fact, I think it's what it means to transcend.
Yeah.
But am I doing this at the expense of godliness and holiness and paradigm building?
Yeah.
whether it's I just had a conversation with Dawson the other day. He got into the Heat and Air program. And I actually caught myself saying, this may be the best thing that's ever happened to you.
Yeah.
It's not.
Right.
It's not
Right.
the best thing. But you can see how, like, the system of the world desires economic advancement.
Yeah.
And the temptation is for me to make his life about that, but that will eat him alive.
Yeah.
To where that's all he's able to see.
Yeah.
And I think that the rich man and Lazarus parable really warns us to that.
Yeah.
So much so that you don't even have a name.
Yeah.
You are
Right.
You're
the rich man.
You're the rich man.
Yeah.
You're described by your sin.
Yeah.
And what ate you.
Yeah.
Which to me is incredible. Even as I talk about it now, I probably need to text Dawson. Say, hey, let's rehab that conversation. But, youth sports, same thing.
Right.
Academics,
It is.
same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we all do get caught up in that. I actually had the conversation. So Kinley and Cameron are both in softball.
Mm-hmm.
And man, I'm on them. I mean, like I'm like, especially Kinley. Kinley's at the age to where, like, I mean, the kids are getting to be pretty good.
Yeah.
At the sport. I mean, to where they're actually looking like softball players.
Yeah.
and so, which Kinley took some years off, and she's behind. And she's. I mean, she just doesn't. When she like catches a fly ball when she's batting, she just doesn't look. It doesn't look like natural. It doesn't look like she's been doing it for a long time. It looks like she's still kind of learning, and a lot of the girls aren't. And so, but again, she don't want to practice either.
Yeah.
It's just like, and I get that. And that's
Yeah.
fine. I mean, you want to. I mean, there's much funner things to do, but if you want to play, got to practice. And so, I'm on her a lot about that. But then, I've been kind of thinking along the same lines. I think yesterday on the way to school, I just told them, I said, I want y'all to know something. I know that we're always on y'all about being the best at school, getting your work done, making good grades, all that good stuff. I'm always on y'all about practicing and getting better in softball. But I want y'all to know that really the most important thing is that you guys grow up into smart, beautiful, and sometimes I struggle for words, but basically good citizens, and that you love Christ.
Yeah.
That you're following Christ. I said that really ultimately is what I want more than anything.
Yeah.
And I said, y'all know that, right?
Yeah.
And of course, my girls are also at the age where they're like, no, we don't know. They're just goofing with me, but I'm just like, okay, all right. But I do think it's, we do get kind of wrapped up in the minutia of life and
the world. Yeah.
And those things are important. And it's like what I tell them about softball. Listen, this is like, it's not about softball. I mean, like at the end of the day, I mean, like going to practice and doing all these things and just getting better. That's not about softball.
Yeah,
It's about life.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
really. I mean, you need team sports just so you know how to function as a team when you go out into the workforce.
Well,
or
and
anything.
you have to encounter something difficult at some point in your life.
You're right.
And in America, we're not out killing our food every morning.
Right.
And so we have to fabricate a little bit of hardship, and a lot of times sports is a great way to do it.
Yep, it is.
Like I said, I'm all for excellence. I think we're called to it. Vody Balcom had a great line one time. Because he played college football.
Yeah.
And I think he even got into like grappling or something at some point. Like he was a very good athlete. And he said it's not the sport itself necessarily that builds character. If that were the case, every NBA player would have perfect character, right? Like we still have to build the character.
Yes, right. Right.
And so, but it goes back to, again, it's the easiest thing to do is to surrender or retreat. Yeah. And so there's a part of me, and look, we love to trade on the money of athleticism, right, is a culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to just kind of say, yeah, I know I do it because it builds character, but not ever make it about character building.
Right.
That's the easiest thing to do. And I think the Bible forces you to always consider, am I just being lazy? Like, it forces you to do that. That's what paradigm building is it's a constant check on, is this a retreat? Is this a surrender?
Yeah.
Am I taking every thought captive? The answer is going to be no.
Yeah.
Because there is no perfection this side of heaven. But that's the requirement.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it is.
The standard doesn't change. It's just, God's gracious.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's good, man. Well, I mean, I'm satisfied if you are.
Yeah.
Right.
It was fun.
Well, thanks for coming down, and we'll do it again.
Yeah,
I mean, this
absolutely.
won't be the last time, and I always enjoy talking to Jason and talking to you. And I mean, I don't think you give yourself enough credit. You're always saying that you're not smart enough to do this or smart enough to do that, but here I'm learning that you've got all these degrees, and I mean, and I know
anybody can go to school,
and I know that's not the weight of intelligence.
Yeah.
I'm not, because I don't have any, but I don't consider myself like terribly smart, but I mean, I
had
can
the
hold
GI
my
Bill
own.
and some time, and that's the only difference.
Right. So I do appreciate you coming on, and like I said, I always appreciate talking to you. I think you've got some. And to going back to the rich man and Lazarus, that was exactly what I was looking for, because that was what stood out to me, was just the fact that he still identified with his sin and who he was in this life. And I've always listened. I like to listen to a lot of debates, and one thing that I was listening to a debate about hell, because I think James White was debating a couple of guys that were annihilationists.
Yeah.
Where they just believe that eventually God will just annihilate folks.
Yeah.
And because I guess the idea is that it just seems out of God's character to punish someone for eternity. And Of course, James White's response to that was, well, I think you underestimate the seriousness of sin, number one, but also I think you assume that once you're in hell that you're going to stop sinning. You won't.
Yeah.
And that's what you see.
Yeah.
In the rich man and Lazarus, he doesn't even stop sinning.
He doesn't.
I mean, his heart is still just as wrecked as it was in his life, and so I think that's an important thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
So. All right, well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
and we'll do it again.
Sounds good.
Thanks, man.
This has been a production of Men of the King. We'd like to thank all of our listeners. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and go check us out at menoftheking.com. Until next time, men, go serve your king.